All right, started.
All right, welcome to our part two book discussion of Everything is Bad for You. Everything Bad is Good for You by Stephen Johnson. I'm Brandon.
I'm Isaac.
I'm Yassir.
And I'm Abdullah.
So, the second third of the book spans from pages about 67 to 133. And so, I think the main thing to understand is that the the text primarily analyzes movies and TV. However, the underlying message talks about it starts with the map of cognitive changes, and it's essentially like a grid with dark spots each time that something interesting or new happens. And so in the older TV shows and movies, it would be like one storyline. But we know with newer TV shows and movies, there's like three or four storylines taking place at the same exact time. And this is an idea that is called multi-threading. And it's like just that, like multiple threads, each thread being like a storyline and having more going on at the same time. And like overall, because of the multi-threading on the map of cognitive changes, you have the addition to the sleeper curve, which like it makes us understand three storylines at one time instead of one, and it's steadily increased, just like video games have over the past 30 years.
Along with the use the his explaining of the multi-threading in the first few pages, he also starts talking about like genre satire with slasher movies and how a certain one called Student Bodies, which was a parody or satire of that certain genre, um, w- basically it plays on it and helps um, kind of help the reader into like or people in general like pop culture into like I don't know, changing expectations and causing people to think more about what they're doing instead of just following the usual set of events that happen in most things, and it's genre breaking type things that helps impact his points that are made earlier in the book in the first section.
Yeah, I agree with what Brandon and Isaac said, and going off what they said, he basically highlighted the main points, being that people should really expand their thinking and really think what's good for them. As he mentions, the movies and the entertainment side, and like also video games as well. So yeah.
And even though we're in part two now, the difference is that we're like Steven Johnson wants to focus more on movies and on TV shows as opposed to video games, but he still brings up the cognitive increase in stimulation there, to have more brain power in understanding like what's going on, and he
Yeah.
still ties it back to the sleeper curve.
Yeah,
And
that's
Isaac mentioned change, and one of one of the big changes is that he talks about in the author talks about in shows like The West Wing, which he likes to bring up a lot. It gives away lots of details about the plot and what's going on without giving the key information. So, like, if you were a viewer watching the show, you would know what's happening, even though you're just getting small tidbits here and there instead of the big ideas. And that also helps us increase the cognitive abilities and stimulation.
I completely agree. And how Steven Johnson talks about how like they started all off like the TV shows with a little more simple, and in the early times the early times of reality TV they didn't like the too complicated shows because they weren't trained enough to follow them, and as they kept on going on with the releasing more TV shows, getting more and more complicated, people got used to them, and it was just a normal thing for them.
Um, one of the concepts that Johnson brings up the start of this section is the flashing arrow door unlocked, which he explains is a satirical thing to kind of help, like, I guess, make fun of the usual, like, set of events that happens. And in this, he gives an example about a 2004 movie called The Day After Tomorrow, and how the director gave the main character a side character which would act as this, and how this shows how kind of talks down to their audience, and kind of outlines how they're not as, I guess, as intelligent or as understanding as they are, which could be used as a teaching method to the audiences and help them progress, like, intellectually.
Yeah, going off what Isaac said, he basically used that example to like go off his main point to prove his point even more, to show that things like that could also be beneficial for you and stuff.
And it's like one of the specific examples. Again, is from the West Wing. West Wing refers to like a part of the White House, like the West Wing section, and it's like the show is about like the president and stuff. However, like the presidential agents and the other White House workers in the show, Johnson describes here, is that they use the term POTUS a lot, which stands for President of the United States. And so he says he continues to say POTUS in the show instead of like the full title until the very end. And his point in bringing this up is that we all know like the president of the United States is like very important, and like we all know his title and everything. However, before the show, some people wouldn't know what the acronym POTUS means. However, with the structure that the director and creator of the West Wing show uses, we're able to get a bigger understanding of what's going on through the small details without knowing like exactly everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, the use of like using terms that the audience wouldn't necessarily know is also exemplified through Johnson's example of a medical show called ER, where he gives a section of a script from a certain episode where they are explaining something wrong with a patient, and what he explains as is that the flashing arrows are here, and how they could simply just say that the person is dying and this is wrong with them. They have to use a excessive amount of medical jargon, as he calls it, to show, I guess, a level of understanding that goes above the audience, but also helps them further understand the source material and what.
Because even though we don't know exactly what all these words mean, like for example, in the text, it says glucinacoma and emphrasilin and tobremism and vitamins A, D, K, and sclera and permatosis and all these extra terms. We still know like this is a hospital scene where they got a patient who has some kind of bodily infraction done onto her. However, it doesn't explicitly say that. And so Stephen Johnson just continues to use examples like this throughout the text to prove his point that like these newer shows are more mentally stimulating.
Yeah, and he uses Stephen Johnson uses these words and examples, and he uses them to appeal to the authors. I think to appeal to them emotionally, because he uses like personal examples like of his own to really get the readers to understand what he's talking about.
Later, after Johnson's is talking about this serious type shows where the vocabulary, and like after he stops discussing that, he starts discussing television drama, where he starts talking about how this is a very dramatic instance of the sleeper curve, where you can basically see instead of the simpleness of shows that like comedies have become more and more complex as the years have gone on, which show the sleeper curve in its full effect.
Yeah, and he said the same thing about video games. How like over time they become more and more complex, and they cause people to think more about things, like to think in different ways that they wouldn't have if they just read a book or something that's viewed today as educational.
Yeah, just like the situation that he provided with if books came in as the new technology instead of video games coming in as the new technology.
And so another trait that Johnson points out here is that on top of having like small details and just increased plot lines and everything, um, within the different plot lines, in somehow, some way, they're all interconnected. And so in older shows that were made like 20, 30, 40 years ago, you would have like an episode that's solely focused on one thing. However, with more seasons and more episodes per season, um, the the shows are more stimulating because of that. And since they're all like in a series, they have they have more connections that can be made. And so in the show ER, the book says the decisive line that scene arrives at the very end. AB, the 16-year-old's blood type connects her to an earlier plot line involving a cerebral hemorrhage victim who, after being dramatically revived in one of the opening scenes, ends up brain dead. So, like, it shows the connection between the two episodes, and that's just one of many examples that are going on. And so, to put it in simple terms, um, the medical officials say AB, which refers to a blood type. And in one of the previous episodes, a different woman had an accident and she needed a blood transfusion. And so she was getting the AB blood from this new victim of some kind of damage.
Not only with crossing plot lines in TV shows and like like evidence of a continued continuity, there is also like in a lot of sitcoms and comedies, there's evidence of layered jokes that like have layers of satire, and they also implement popular culture. Where say you have a Halloween episode in a comedy TV show, you'll have references to classic Halloween movies like Nightmare on Elm Street or Ghostbusters or The Terminator or Shining, and they're parodying, just showing how popular culture is kind of flipped on itself, and instead of growing, it's starting to like fold in and cross over into itself, showing the advancement of.
One of one of the other points that Stephen Johnson makes in part two of the book, Everything Bad is Good for You, is that with TV drama, in particular to other types of film, it shows the biggest instance of the sleeper curve based on how much information the viewer needs to understand what's going on. Like, for example, in older shows, all the information was essentially spoon fed to you through the actions of the characters and the plot line and what's going on. However, in newer shows, less information is given to you, and you need more, whether it's common knowledge or specified knowledge to a certain topic. For example, in The West Wing, it would be like politics, or in ER, it would be medicine. You need more information as to what's going on. And that shows the change. And because you need to know more what's going on, Stephen Johnson ties it back to the sleeper curve, how we need more, or how we are having more. And consequently, we also need more cognitive stimulation. And our brains are being enhanced unconsciously to understand what's happening.
Yeah, he uses lots of examples of like sleeper curves and stuff, and how, like how Brandon said, like newer television shows are the reasons for people's expanded brains, because the information given to them, the information now given to them and given to them, is causing them to like think more, and like majority of the time they're left to make their own assumptions about things. So yeah.
He also explores the idea of, as people have become more and more accustomed to the more advanced and more complex TV shows have had to become more and more, like, even more complex than they were before, such as the show he talks about, The Sopranos, and then shows like, see what exactly he said, like The Apprentice is what he it shows that how demanding they are to their audience, and plot lines and continuity, not with shows like, say, The Apprentice or Hill Street, which show, a very simple continuity, whereas serialized shows show the sleeper curve and back as time goes on.
Yeah, he talks about the Sopranos and how it's more complicated than some of the other shows that came out earlier, but people still continue to watch it. And it was a very popular show just because, like Brandon said, people's minds got trained to watching this type of complicated TV shows, and their brain has developed that cognitive ability to be able to like comprehend and basically know what the show is talking about.
Yeah, and
oh no, Yassir,
all right, and he spoke a lot about this in part 1, but in part 2 he spoke a little bit about this, the video games and the complexity that came with them. It's different from the TV shows and stuff, because people don't really have to make any assumptions in the video games, but it's more of like, it was more of like what he said was like logical thinking, and like critical thinking was like one of the examples they use that really helps people, and what makes it classified as good for you, I guess.
After he starts talking about game shows and video games, and then he starts going in how the reality TV show is kind of the final, I guess, form of pop culture and probably like reality, kind of folding in on itself and becoming like so satirical you can't even tell that it is, and how it seems like it's kind of reverting back to what it was, where it was like way more basic and you didn't really need as much complexity to it, but it still shows evidence of that being there.
In the middle of Stephen Johnson talking about all the reality TV shows and like all these other shows that that are being like portrayed here, he shifts over from the sleeper curve into another section that specifically really stood out to me. It's like in any typical like good essay or text where you're trying to argue a point, you always have a counter argument, and then you bring it up and then shut it down. And so this especially stood out to me in this book because he's arguing the point that like everything bad is good for you, like TV shows and video games, etc., are really good for you. So on page 90, he in the middle of the page he starts a new section by saying, skeptics might argue that I stacked the deck here by focusing on relatively highbrow titles, like popular ones, like The Simpsons or The West Wing, when in fact, the most significant change in the last 5 years of narrative entertainment has nothing to do with complex dramas or self-referential sitcoms. So he brings that up, and I really like the point that he's making because it shows like it's not just the popular titles that have attention that are the ones with all the different multi-threads, plot lines on in the cognitive map that overall increase our sleeper curve unconsciously. It's like a lot more than just that, and that's what stood out to me, and I like that.
I think we've covered pretty much everything that was important in the second part, and now we're gonna start talking about the reviews that we each of us gathered and wrote about. So the first review I got was from The Guardian, and it talked about how it said it was a barbaric instrumental view of art. And it was clear the author of this review did not agree with what Johnson had portrayed, and he said that popular culture isn't doing what he says and making people smarter. It is doing the exact opposite is what he seems to believe, and how instead of what people would believe to be actual science, logos is actually a pseudoscience just to puff up his points and not actually show the true facts behind his claim.
Yeah, I also got a review that was from the New York Times by Kern Walter, and he talked about how this book was like especially the second part of the book, was like a shocker, and it was a very good like part because it hit the he explained his points so well that even to like the older people in the older generation, it really shocked them and hit them, and they were like, "Wow, this is like really what it is."
Yeah, I also for my second review I did use the New York Times one, and he did the author did agree and back up Johnson's claims in a very surprising way, which I did not expect to see, especially from reading the.
Yeah, I didn't expect to see it very often either. I expected a lot of people, especially the people from the older generations, to like disagree because that's just what their belief wasn't to begin with. That just wasn't their belief.
I
Yeah,
agree with Abdullah. How like I would expect also like the older generations and most other people would disagree with Johnson. And so I read an article from The Guardian that was similar to Isaac's. And so there's two sentences that stuck out to me. And based on the title, Everything Bad is Good for You, the very first engaging sentence of the review says, I read this book while chain smoking, glugging whiskey, and eating massive quantities of dairy products. And so, as we know, like these three things are like bad, like chain smoking isn't good, glugging whiskey isn't good, and eating massive quantities of dairy products aren't good. And so I think he included this sentence, like obviously he doesn't support Johnson's claims made in his book, Everything Bad is Good for You. However, I think it's a really engaging sentence that he brings up because all these things are much worse than just like simply watching TV or playing video games. And
Yeah, like
even though I disagree with the author of this review, and I personally agree with Johnson, and even though the reviewer person doesn't, I still commend him for the engaging introduction that he has.
yeah, that the author in that book, that very first part really got me because I knew what the author's point of view was going to be as soon as I saw those three that first sentence talking about how he was glugging whiskey, chain smoking, and eating tons of dairy products.
yeah. I got a review from the Publishers Weekly, and in the review, the person was basically saying that he does agree with Johnson's ideas and thoughts, but there's like it's to an extent. Like there's obviously some things that Johnson was talking about that like isn't really gonna benefit everybody. Like for example, video games. Not all video games is gonna benefit everybody because some people like to learn and think differently. And he's basically saying that like there's to like he agrees with him, but there's like to an extent of things, like not fully, like, but like he's basically saying Johnson is right in a way.
Another sentence from my review from The Guardian that stuck out to me, and the one that I specifically highlighted for the worksheet, was that what might smarter mean? Johnson never says and systematically blurs crucial distinctions. So obviously, there's he says words like intellectually demanding and cognitive facilities and challenges and intellectual benefits. However, he never really defines what smarter means, and that's the main issue that this author has, because the title of Everything Bad is Good for You, like, and in the introduction to the book, it specifically talks about like how things are making us smarter. And even though I agree with him, the author of the review does make a strong point here when he asks what does smarter mean, because it's like different to everybody. And it summarizes the points of the argument from the review, and secondly, it attacks like directly one of the two primary claims that Johnson makes in his book, and he strongly criticizes Johnson for claiming newer pop culture makes us stronger. It doesn't define what smart is or what it necessarily means, and so that's his main flaw in the argument, and the author of the review points that out. And I think even though the point that the reviewer makes overall is weak, personally, and I think it's irrelevant, to be completely honest. It's still a good structure of a review that he makes, and I completely disagree, but like I understand his perspective.
Yeah, the author of the Guardian review definitely does a decent job at introducing his claims against Johnson by and refuting his points. But I feel like that it's a very biased review, even though he does a decent job at doing it. It seems very biased and not necessarily not backed up by things in the book, but it's not backed up by, he doesn't provide any actual like feasible evidence that what Johnson's saying is wrong. He just says that he doesn't give enough evidence and therefore he's wrong, which I feel like isn't good enough to consist of a bad review of the book. Johnson's claims were still evident, but
Yeah,
did a good job.
I feel like he's not going based off like textual evidence from Johnson's book. He's basically just going from like opinion based.
Yeah, I feel like he's just putting he's kind of like putting words in Johnson's mouth as like the phrase, and he's just basically proving his point by using by just keep distracting him from the actual argument. That's how he's keeping up with his argument, and that's why it seems somewhat legit.
Yeah. Well, we're right at that in time mark, and to summarize, we discussed how Everything Bad and Good for You by Steven Johnson. The second third at least focused a lot on television and visual forms of media have helped cement people as like help increase their general intelligence and problem solving skills instead of hindering them as others would see.
Yeah, I feel like in this part he basically just gave his evidence. Like in the first part, he like stated his claim and what he thought, and in this part of the book, he basically just gave like factual evidence about it. Yeah.
The biggest shift, I think, is especially from video games to reality TV, and I think good job on his part. Like somewhat coincidental that like when we switch from the first third to the second third, it directly like exactly switches from video games to TV shows, and the two main points that he brings up are the effect of the sleeper curve and how it works within the reality TV and the new movies. And then the second part is what I brought up about how he stretches and emphasizes the refute to a counterclaim that skeptics may bring up.
Yes.
Also, very strong point that he brought up was the one where he said the only reason these shows these complicated reality shows got popular is because they got used to watching these shows and their cognitive developed.
So this overall concludes our Everything Bad is Good for You by Stephen Johnson, Part 2. Video discussion book review. I'm Brandon.
Isaac.
I'm Yassir. Abdullah.
Yep.
And that's Abdullah. Have a great day, everyone.